All right, I think we're on air. Hello and welcome to Sigma Phi's Distinguished Lectureship Series. I'm Katie Burke, Digital Features Editor at American Scientist, and I'm here today with George Weiblin, a plant biologist at the University of Minnesota. George, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, Katie. Thanks for having me on your program.
Sure. So before we start, I'd like to make sure viewers watching us live note that you can submit questions to ask George through the chat window on this Adobe Connect website, or you can also ask them through Twitter using the hashtag AmSciTalks. That's AMSCITALKS, AmSciTalks. And Sigma Psi members can also discuss this topic afterward by logging on to the Sigma Psi communities page. Okay, one of George's research areas, the plant biology, genetics, and crop science of cannabis. There are two varieties of the species Cannabis sativa. One is marijuana and the other one is industrial hemp. George, without getting into the genetics yet, what are the similarities and differences between marijuana and industrial hemp?
Well, as you said, they're both members of the same species, but they differ in the qualities that we as humans find of economic interest. In fact, there are many, many hundreds or potentially thousands of different or cultivars, cultivated forms of plant cannabis, but they generally fall into a small number of categories, and you can separate the hemp from the marijuana varieties on the basis of their drug content and their fiber and seed quality as well. As hemp is primarily associated with the fiber and the seed production, whereas marijuana with drug production.
Mhm. And so, what is industrial hemp used for? It's and what among those uses? What are the most profitable of and uses of interest in the hemp market right now?
Well, it's a really interesting crop in that it supports such a diverse range of uses. The stems of the plant are very fibrous, and these fibers are extremely durable and lightweight. So they've been used in cloth making, paper making, and increasingly combined with cement or various kinds of resins, they can be used to form all kinds of building materials which have really lightweight and strong properties. So that's the fiber use. Um, and then you have the seeds, which are highly nutritious and rich in the omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid mix that a lot of folks are looking for as a dietary supplement. And these can be used, in many food products as well as cosmetics and so forth. And those are the main kinds of hemp uses. And then, of course, it's the flowers of the plants that are smoked as a recreational drug, or from which the psychoactive uh, cannabinoid molecule THC is extracted and ingested. And this is one of the oldest cultivated plants. We have archaeological records going back, 13,000 years that show that humans were working with this plant and using it in a variety of ways really early on in agriculture.
And where in the world were these early uses?
Well, there are Egyptian tombs, for instance, and records from the Middle East. There's archaeological evidence from ancient China. Pretty much every major ancient civilization, except for those in the Americas, had and used hemp, and that's because hemp originated in the Old World and was brought to the New World by European colonists.
Mhm.
So, in fact, the founding fathers were hemp farmers in the United States.
That's right. It used to be quite a profitable industry in the early Americas, right?
Well, I couldn't really speak to how profitable it was, but it was certainly a useful crop that was widely cultivated particularly where I'm from in Minnesota, in the upper Midwest. Probably the most recent uh, hemp agriculture we had was during World War II when the Department of the Army built hemp mills and distributed hemp seed to Minnesota farmers who grew it as a source of fiber for the war effort, making canvas and cordage and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
A lot of what we have now growing wild in Minnesota is descended from that hemp that was grown during the Second World War. And just recently, we've started to look into that and try to understand what's happened to the plant genetically since it escaped from cultivation and became a ditchweed.
Uh-huh. Um, and what have you found so far about how it's evolved since the mid 20th century?
Well, one of the things, when plants escape from an agricultural setting, and this is an annual plant, that dies every year and seed comes up again. So it's been through many generations of natural selection adapting to the environment. And so one of the things we've discovered is that although industrial hemp the seed germinates readily, uh, in our cold climate here in Minnesota, this escaped cannabis, now we have a very difficult time germinating the seed because it requires cold, and it's adapted to survive our harsh winters. Because this seed falls to the ground in October, and if we have a mild December, it could germinate. So we've had selection going on, and now we're finding that these wild cannabis populations, when we bring them into the lab, um, and try to germinate the seed, we have real difficulty. They need to go through a cold treatment, so they become cold tolerant or cold hardy or cold adapted.
Right. And so the big difference between marijuana, or one of the big differences between marijuana and industrial hemp, as you mentioned, is the drug content, and that really comes down to THC content. And last year, you published a paper in the new Phytologist with some surprising results about the underlying genetics of THC's absence or near absence in industrial hemp. So tell us about those results.
So, what my lab started working on about 15 years ago was the genetic basis of the difference between hemp and marijuana in terms of their cannabinoid content, their drug content. And we basically we conducted an experiment where we took a hemp strain from Canada and a drug strain from the Netherlands. We imported those under a DEA permit to a controlled, secure lab facility where we grew these plants up and we crossed them to make a hybrid of the two. And then we took that hybrid and produced seed from it, and then grew those seeds up to look.
Uh-oh. I'm not sure whether George is still there. George, can you hear me? just wait here then. So we can get George back.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. I can't see you.
Uh, All right, I will turn on my video. I'm so sorry we got disconnected.
That's okay. Oh,
Sorry about
there you
that.
are. No worries.
When did I drop
Okay,
out?
so you dropped out right basically just as you were starting to talk about the new phytologist results.
Oh,
So you
okay.
might want to
So
just kind of start at the
the
beginning.
paper
Yeah.
the paper we published in 2015. Yeah,
Hmm.
so this was an experiment where we crossed hemp with marijuana and grew up this hybrid, and then we took the seed from that hybrid and grew those grandchildren up to look at the variation in the drug profile of this hemp and marijuana cross, and that then enabled us to dig deeper into the genes that we think are responsible for producing THC, and in the one particular gene that does the final biochemical step to take THC from its building block precursor molecule and turn it into the final drug. We found that gene was not the one actually responsible for the difference, but rather a related gene that is responsible for a different part of this biochemical assembly line and in fact it produces a different cannabinoid called CBD or cannabidiol. And cannabidiol is the second most abundant cannabinoid in cannabis plants. And it turns out they share the same precursor. And so what our study showed was that it's not the gene for THC that makes a marijuana plant have more THC than a hemp plant, but in fact it's a mutation in the CBD enzyme, the gene for the CBD enzyme. This mutation knocks out this competing enzyme so that cannabis plants they make only THC when in fact the enzyme for CBD in the hemp plants we've looked at it's a superior competitor. So this is a case of not of the winner of this race does so because the competitor gets knocked out before reaching the end of the finish line, and that's how we end up with plants that have a lot of THC. One of the common myths is that hemp plants don't have any THC. That's not true. They have some THC. They just don't have enough THC to get anybody high. That's the main difference. And in fact, the marijuana plants, they also have CBD too.
And so is one more likely to occur in the wild than the other? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, well, it depends on what geographic area you're in. Here in the upper Midwest, The plants that we've studied that are feral, escaped, growing in ditches and roadsides, they're of the hemp type in terms of their cannabinoid profile.
Hmm.
Yeah,
But other
for the most
places
part.
than
For the
marijuana
most
can
part.
also grow wild.
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah. So, if in Afghanistan, for instance, or the mountains of Morocco, the plants that have escaped there are of the drug type,
Uh-huh.
and um, I can't prove it, but I would speculate that this might be true in some of the areas, in Mexico or California where there's been a lot of illicit marijuana cultivation.
Right. Yeah. And I would imagine well, I think it's also interesting that the gene that everybody had put so much attention on was actually not the most important ultimately. That it took a lot more genetic research and a focus on hemp ultimately to uncover some of that research.
Yeah, and it's just kind of an interesting part of science that you have a strongly held assumptions, and you do the experiments and you find that the results don't meet your expectations, and you have to keep looking. And I think that's something that a lot of folks don't necessarily appreciate about science. They tend to think of it as, this is a textbook. We already know. Some of our deeply held ideas turn out not to be correct. And we had a difficult time persuading our peers who had to review this paper that we had an answer, we had an alternative explanation. And we struggle with that all the time in our work. Um,
Yeah.
you just never know
What
how
was
it's going to turn out.
So what was like the first result that you got back that was kind of just a head scratcher where you were like you had thought that you were going to get this really straightforward answer about the genes underlying THC and then you got something wonky.
Yeah, well, um, the work that we did, the simple experiment, which is a lot like what that Czech monk Gregor Mendel did, crossing his P's to discover the simple laws of inheritance.
Right.
Um, we found a very simple pattern of inheritance when we looked at THC. We found that basically there's three basic chemical classes: high THC plants,
Hmm.
high CBD plants, and intermediate plants that have an intermediate level of intermediate ratio of THC and CBD. And in our population, they fell into a neat ratio of 1 to 2 to 1, where
Which is
for
that
every
class 10 a
one
billion
high
ratio.
THC plant and every one high CBD plant, there are on average two of these intermediate plants, and that suggests a single gene with two different variants, either for high THC or high CBD. And your intermediate plants, because they have every plant's got two chromosomes. You got one copy of each of those genes, and that was the simplest explanation. But when we looked at the THC gene that we thought would be the candidate for that, it turned out that they all share the same copy of the gene, and so that couldn't be it.
Yeah.
Um, Now we found that this CBD gene is really closely linked to that THC gene. They probably arose through an ancient evolutionary duplication that goes back long before humans ever interacted with this plant. I mean,
And a
closest
duplication is
relative of
when it's like when one gene is copied and then by mistake it's duplicated on the same chromosome, right?
right, yeah. So you get these duplications occurring, and if they stick around, sometimes these different copies of the gene um, get hit with mutations. In the rare case where a mutation might serve some kind of new function, then that gene can kind of take off on its own, and a new kind of evolutionary trajectory. So this is a really common pattern in evolution, to see genes duplicated and then taking on new functions. A lot of people think, well, that's sort of like these genes become they become increasingly they become perfected at carrying out different functions. What was really a surprise about our work, and is still kind of a head scratcher for a lot of people, is that it's actually knocking out a gene that has been by knocking out this competing gene, humans have selected for this drug type cannabis. So we think that that mutation was out there, and in relatively recent, in the context of human history, this drug type cannabis, humans have picked up on it and have favored it, such that it is really very widespread now, and widely cultivated, because it's got this mutation that knocks out the enzyme that that produces the non-euphoric cannabinoid,
Uh-huh.
the
And so we have a
CBD.
question
Yeah.
that ties in really well from the audience from Christopher Grassa, and he says, "Do we know why the plant evolved to produce these compounds, THC and CBD?" Which kind of
So
ties in with what you're saying
yeah,
here.
why? Why are these things there? There are some who claim that we have these neuroreceptors in our brains, so that they're there so that the good Lord enabled us the opportunity to get high, and the plants provide this for us.
Good Lord, the
There,
enabler.
there, there are other explanations, and if you look at these chemicals, they are part of a chemical class that the plant doesn't need for its basic function, its basic metabolism. They're called secondary chemicals, and there are so many in plants. So many of our drugs and spices and things come from these secondary chemicals. Uh, it's a matter of speculation, but if you look at where they're located on the plant, they're on these leafy structures that enclose the developing seeds. And on those leafy structures are these tiny plant hairs that they contain resin. And these resins are rich in these terpenoids that give it a really stinky aroma, and also these cannabinoids. And if you think about a plant protecting its seed, so that it can mature, these resinous hairs can deter insects that might prey on the developing seed. They're sticky, and they could be unattractive to insects. That's kind of the leading explanation for why they're there. They're especially concentrated
They had
around the
some sort of
developing seeds.
they had some sort of defensive property,
Yeah,
and then from there they could have been selected for after that by humans.
yeah, and there's so many examples of that in
Hmm.
plants. From cinnamon, which is a bark of a tree, to cloves, which are the tiny flower buds of another tree, and these chemicals have, they're deterrents to feeding. Yeah.
Hmm. Uh, so let's see. I also want to ask you. So currently, most hemp sold in the U.S. is not grown here, but that could change as more than half of our 50 states have passed legislation to make it easier to grow hemp domestically, although it still is somewhat difficult. Uh, what problems, um, well, what is the current state of the policy? Like, when can you and can't you grow it? What problems does this introduce for the Drug Enforcement Agency, and how might your research help with a solution?
So the challenge is that you have um, the same species that can produce what is a scheduled controlled substance in federal law, but also other forms of the plant that are really not a threat to health or safety. And this is a problem. the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 is written in such a way as to exclude the cultivation of cannabis in the United States. 2014 Farm Bill introduced there's a law in the 2014 Farm Bill that opens up the door to uh, research on industrial hemp and cultivating industrial hemp in states that have state laws uh, that define hemp on a THC on the basis of THC content and a low THC level. So since that law passed, things have opened up quite a bit, uh, but it's still technically not. It's still not legal to transport hemp across state lines, hemp plants across state lines, or viable seed across state lines. That's a real problem for a young industry.
Yeah.
Now, hemp products, on the other hand, and I have several to show you. Uh, there's no problem with those. We have clear legal uh, basis for permitting the production of hemp materials and use of hemp. It's the cultivation, yeah,
Mhm.
that's the issue. So, what are some of the things we've got here? This is hemp in soap in liquid form. We've got a hemp hand. This is hand soap.
Uh-huh.
We have uh, that's of course extracted from the seeds. So you got cosmetics being used there. We've got these are uh, toasted salted hemp seeds, kind of crunchy, kind of like sunflower seeds, except you can eat the shells. The
I
hemp
actually have heard,
hearts.
I don't know whether hemp actually sounds delicious to me.
Well, this stuff has a really nutty flavor.
Uh-huh.
It's very tasty. We just made some almond. Uh, these are hulled hemp seeds. They've had the shells taken off, and we made
Okay.
some almond hulled hemp seed cookies that were really tasty. Folks add this to their yogurt or their breakfast cereal, or it's good. It's folks sprinkle it over. Um, Grilled meats and things, put it in salads, all kinds of uses. What else? We have some of the fiber products. This is a hemp, uh, just hemp cloth, very durable, lasts forever. And then increasingly popular are these hemp cotton blends, which are quite soft but last much longer than than regular cotton. And these are hemp underwear.
I think this is the first live interview I've done where somebody pulled out a pair of underwear to show.
I'm so
To show
sorry
us.
if that. I'm so sorry if I've embarrassed Sigma Xi. That was certainly not my intent.
No, I think people are gonna love it. And so hemp as a fabric, as a fiber, is especially durable and also soft. Why would you use hemp fabric versus
Yeah,
another
it's
material?
not particularly soft compared to cotton, but when blended with cotton, it softens up a lot. The fibers are hundreds of times longer than cotton fibers, so that lends to the durability.
Uh-huh.
And because they're so strong, they and lightweight, they can be melded with cement and resins and things to produce really innovative kinds of building materials. So that hempcrete is something people are interested in. But at the present time, most of the domestic market in the U.S. is really focused on the seed and the seed oil for the edible and for the food and cosmetics. That's where I think it's $600 million a year now in the domestic market, which is still small relative to a lot of um, commodity crops, but is it's growing every year. There's a lot of
Mhm.
interest among folks who are interested in healthy and sustainable alternatives.
And
Yeah.
uh, so there's this problem for the Drug Enforcement Agency of this very useful, potentially profitable crop. that looks just very much like a crop that they have to monitor, uh, and and try to keep out of at least places where it's being grown illegally. Um, how might your research help with that problem?
Yeah. Well, we got genetic testing now that if there's a question about whether a plant is likely to produce THC in a quantity that exceeds the legal thresholds, we can test for that. So that's a potential application. I think, in the bigger picture, it's just bringing some clarity and some objectivity to a economically important plant that is just widely misunderstood. People have such strongly held opinions about it, for good or bad, that lack evidence to support their positions. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Hemp products are not going to get you, are not going to have the kind of psychoactivity that is a risk to health and safety. And I'm sorry, medical marijuana is not as safe as many people think it is. There's just a lot of confusion out there on that issue, and I think
Yeah,
people
let's.
just, I think society, can benefit from just some evidence-based considerations, because the plant is not going away. Um,
Right. Been here for a long time.
yes, I mean it's deeply intertwined with our history, and um, um, it's got so much potential. If only we could align, public policy with what makes sense in terms of medicine, in terms of agriculture and food.
Mhm. So let's unpack that a little bit more because the first thing I did when I started researching for this story was Google industrial hemp and cannabis. And of course, that turned up a big mixture of websites and a lot of misinformation. And so, what are some of the common myths that you see and hear most often? And what do you say to dispel them?
Well, it's a great question, and actually, one of the very recent developments that has really complicated my life and telling the story of hemp is the fact that, in just a few years ago, some marijuana breeders in Colorado introduced a new type of cannabis which contains a lot of the CBD molecule I was just talking about, and not so much THC. It's sort of like taking everything that a marijuana plant is and just swapping out CBD for THC. And these high CBD strains of cannabis have attracted a lot of attention because it turns out, for some individuals, this high CBD doses appear to have some very strong health benefits. And it got the most attention in the case of rare seizure disorders, and one called Dravet syndrome, where young children suffering hundreds of seizures a day don't live very long because they just can't function. And a couple of parents seeking alternative therapy stumbled upon these high CBD strains and found that symptoms just miraculously um, dissipated. I'm going to close my shade here. It looks like the sun is
Yeah, yeah.
glinting off the
Like
camera.
there.
Afternoon here. Hopefully that's a little better. Yeah. So So now you have people marketing this high CBD oil, calling it hemp oil. You know,
Oh,
when we have hemp seed oil, which doesn't have cannabinoids in it, it's all fat. You know, it's fatty acids. So, and people are marketing this and moving it around as though it's hemp, and that muddles definitions even more because now we have you know, CBD being used as medicine and sold as hemp when we've been saying hemp is not a drug for so long. So that's a difficult one to disentangle right
hmm.
now. What are some of the what are some of the other myths that hemp plants can spontaneously become drug producing? I haven't seen any evidence for that. Uh, that um, that uh, cannabinoids are safe. Certainly safer than many other drugs. Arguably safer than alcohol or tobacco. But there are significant issues with
Like what? What are
cannabis
some of the
use.
risks that you have seen in the literature?
Well, I mean, I'm not a physician by any means, but just looking at some of the information that's out there, you know, in uh, in psychiatry and so forth, there are correlations between cannabis use and some forms of mental illness, and where the cause and effect lies isn't clear. But
Mhm.
you know, um, folks with schizophrenia uh, tend to exhibit more symptoms when they're using cannabis than not.
Mhm.
And there is a correlation of kids who use cannabis early uh, may express a higher incidence of schizophrenia. Now, is that because they had certain behaviors, you know, they're just associating, you know, just doing risky behavior or choosing to do this, and it's not the cannabis that's driving it? We don't know. But this is one of the things that I think, with you know, recent interest, especially in medical cannabis,
Mhm.
more studies are being funded now to look not just at the potential risks, but also benefits. So I think there's a lot more to be learned about that, but that's not really the focus of my research. I'm a botanist. I'm interested in the plant and how it does what it does.
Yeah, so let's talk about how you got into that. You started out as one of the first researchers in the US permitted to study and legally grow cannabis. And and how did you get into studying cannabis and originally and getting that privilege?
Yeah, it's well, it's a kind of a funny story. I had, you know, for my PhD research, I'd studied a related group of plants, the fig trees, and you wouldn't
How are they
the
related?
ancestry that they share wouldn't be obvious. Um, but in fact, hemp, hops, figs, mulberries, stinging nettles, these are all plants that are part of a big lineage that I've been studying now since my graduate days. And at the time that I was hired as an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, uh, back in 2001, we had a populist governor named Jesse Ventura, a professional wrestler, who, among his many popular positions, was a call to look into what the problems are associated with industrial hemp. Why can't we grow industrial hemp in Minnesota where we did back in World War II, and now our neighbors to the north, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, are growing it, and we're buying it from them.
Uh-huh.
So there was a call to for to take this up, and at the time, I got nothing but ridicule from many quarters about the professor of pot, and why are you doing this, and can't you study some
When
other
was this?
plant?
What year? What decade or what years?
This is 2001.
Okay, yeah.
2001. A lot has changed since then. Now
Yeah.
there are hundreds of researchers who are suddenly interested in cannabis, and by some miracle, or perhaps just a lot of patience and persistence, I went through the formal process of getting a research registration from DEA to study Schedule One controlled substance, which is the most restrictive class of controlled substances you can study. And we had to develop these protocols that are so tight to prevent any kind of diversion of material, out of the lab, or, out of the growth facility, and document, make sure we've destroyed everything at the end of these experiments. And it's quite an interesting process, to go through that. And at first you might think, well, that's ridiculous. This stuff is harmless. What's the big deal? But given the interest in the topic, and some of the folks who've stalked us and shown a lot of interest in the project, I'm I'm much more comfortable at sleeping at night knowing that we have this secure and permitted way of working with this.
Yeah.
But it puts me in a very different place compared to many of the folks who handle cannabis on a daily basis. Which
Uh-huh.
which reminds
Yeah.
me, I have a prop here. Can you see that?
Not yet. At least
Not
I
yet.
can't.
Oh, here
Yeah.
we go.
Gotta go further over.
Yeah,
There it is.
yeah. This is a plant from our one of our growth chambers. It's a descended from Minnesota feral hemp that we collected in the field this fall.
Nice. And so how long? So you collected it, and it's germinated fairly recently. It's just a couple of months old,
Yeah. Oh, it's just a few
and
weeks old. Yeah.
just a few weeks old.
Yeah.
And then, how long will you grow it, and what will you study on it or harvest from it?
Yeah, so what will happen to this plant now? Right now, we're growing it under 18 hours of daylight, and we'll do that for a number of weeks, and then we'll cut back the day length because cannabis is what's called a short day plant. As the days get shorter, it triggers flowering. So once this plant flowers, we will cross it with other plants uh, that are descended from this same population. We'll take the pollen from a male plant and dust it onto the flowers of the female plant to produce some seed. We'll allow that seed to mature and collect it. Then we'll take just a tiny pinch of a leaf and extract DNA from it.
Mhm.
We will take some of the flowers and harvest them and dry them and send them to another lab where they will measure the quantity of the cannabinoids, so we'll know how much THC and how much CBD is in the plant, and we'll compare those results with the genetic tests that we have. What we're trying to do is validate that this genetic test we've got actually
Right.
will work in more than just the plants that we included in our original experiment. So it's ongoing work.
Cool. We also have a question from the audience. This is from Diane Timblin. She says, if I remember correctly, hemp was used for numerous practical purposes in colonial America. Were there any that might surprise us, or
Mm.
any beyond the expected, like textiles, that might be good to consider reintroducing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of a couple of examples. One, Thomas Jefferson in his garden book has this little note in which he says um uh, it is it's more desirable that we get underway with our cultivation of hemp. I find it much more valuable than tobacco. And the more of it we lay aside, the happier I'll be, or something like that, which is quite a funny quote. Um,
Yeah.
then, but some of the surprising uses, which are not so funny. One worth mentioning, I think, is little known fact that the strength of hemp row was such that it was used in hanging, and you
Wow.
in by
Like
law
hanging people
hanging. Yes,
for
yeah, yeah, and that's a dark
for fun.
part of hemp's history. In that laws, in fact, because of the potential for a rope to break, laws stated that it had to be hemp rope.
Wow.
That's a dark fact. Um, but the other uses, in those days, in colonial America, it was really about the textiles and the paper. Um, the widely touted example of the Declaration of Independence being written on hemp paper, um, and I think those are important hemp facts. It's the seed that has really exploded in recent years as a really surprising, useful thing in terms of the oil as cosmetic and food.
Mhm. We have another question from the audience from Sherry Parr. Uh, she asks, and I'm not sure whether you can exactly answer this one because you're not a physician, but but we'll give it a shot anyway. She says physicians recommend CBD oil for cancer patients. Is there a significant difference between the oil from hemp versus the marijuana plant? And there would be, right? Yeah.
There, yes, and this is a great question and gets back to that complicated issue I was talking about uh, moments ago, where
Right.
the CBD oil is now getting a lot of attention. Suddenly,
And is being
everybody,
called hemp oil, correct?
sometimes it's being called hemp oil. Uh, the the issue for me there is confusing it with the oil that is extracted from the seeds when they're pressed, which doesn't have CBD in it.
And
Um,
is used for a lot of
and is
cosmetic
used for a
things,
lot
right?
of things, and is not used as medicine. But
Okay.
CBD oil right now, I guess you'd call it one of these nutraceuticals, one of these unregulated. It's not FDA approved or FDA regulated. It's just this. It's in this gray area right now, and
Mm-hmm.
it can be extracted from hemp plants. But
Mm-hmm.
honestly, most of what is being sold as CBD oil is probably derived from these hemp marijuana hybrids that have been selected for producing lots and lots of the cannabinoids.
Mm-hmm.
So, your typical commercial hemp strain, if you measure the drug content or the cannabinoid content, it'll be 1 to 2% of the dry weight of the plant. But these drug types, now thanks to breeding,
Mm-hmm.
uh, percent dry weight, 20 to 30% dry weight
Wow.
in cannabinoids. And depending on which genes you have, you can either be producing mostly THC or mostly CBD or an intermediate of each. So it gets tricky when we talk about hemp and marijuana. I don't think the plants that produce 20 to 30% CBD can fairly be called hemp plants. There's something else, and I don't think we have a name for them yet.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very good question.
Yep.
And I won't speak um, to the farm, to the what physicians are recommending and cancer and so forth. But I can say that the way that these cannabinoids interact with our nervous systems is dramatically different between THC and CBD. And it takes very little THC to produce dramatic effects. But for CBD, because of the way it interacts with the body, it takes a lot of CBD to see effects. And so that has driven up the demand for this because on a quantity basis, people are taking thousands of times more CBD than they would take in the form of THC to achieve some effect. And whether it's whether the cancer, that's very controversial. Certainly, the experiments uh, in vitro, the experiments on the Petri plates, clearly you can inhibit the growth of cancer cells with CBD. That is established. But many chemicals do that on a Petri plate. But when it comes to the human body, it's a different story. And is the quantity that someone could ingest even comparable to the effect that you get on a Petri plate? We don't know, but I know that NIH, National Institutes of Health, has recently supported studies that are looking into all of this in a clinical setting.
So the science will be more settled in the nearish future.
Well, I mean, science is never settled, but I think we're going to learn something.
Yeah,
Hopefully,
yeah, okay.
hopefully soon. The sooner the better.
So I want to talk a little bit more about how your research has changed, especially in 2015. Then your home state of Minnesota passed the Industrial Hemp Act, making it legal to grow hemp there, at least for research, right? Uh, and so, how has that changed your research,
Yeah.
being able to grow it there?
So, prior to a state law for industrial hemp research, we were working so only within the protocols that we were able to approve through DEA, which limit the sources of material to what we can import from abroad
Hmm.
or acquire from other registered cannabis labs. And so, when I first started studying the subject, there were very few registered cannabis labs from which I could, get material. We had to import from abroad. That was extremely difficult because you got to get permits from both countries and work through all of that. So we've been very limited in terms of what material we could work on. Yeah, if I had $1 for every person who's volunteered to provide us with material, I wouldn't be writing research grants. but we can't take that, of course, because I'm at a research university, and we comply with regulations that govern research. That's just what we do. So,
Hmm.
um,
Oh no, I think we might have lost you again. There we go. George just left a message, so he's coming back. Oh, and I can hear you, I think now. Hi, George.
Yes, I'm back. Sorry about that. I don't know
That's okay.
why my screen keeps hanging up on you guys, but
That's okay. Um, well, you had just about finished that answer to your question about how your research had changed after Minnesota made it legal to grow hemp in your home state, making it a lot easier for you to get new seeds and try new breeding programs, right?
yeah. So now we're going to use the wild populations that we've sampled to try to confirm the results we published previously. And ultimately, the hope is that we might be able to develop some useful hemp genetics
Hmm.
from these old these old populations that are descended from the American hemp that was probably bred in Kentucky way back,
Because
but
that was the place where it was
those
grown a lot
genetics are
in early,
advanced.
right?
Sorry?
Kentucky was a place where there was a lot of a big hemp industry in earlier in the United
Yes,
States.
yes, yes.
Also,
And
while
I
I'm
think,
saying something, I still can't see you. You might need
oh,
to press a button to make us be able to see you.
yes, there we go. Okay.
There you go.
Hey, so,
Hi.
um, yeah, so the a lot of the hemp that was distributed during the war effort was the seed was developed in Kentucky.
Okay.
But there is no seed bank for that material because of um, uh, cannabis being regarded as a drug.
Mhm.
Seed collections have been were purged, material was destroyed. We don't actually have that a lot of that material to go back to from American hemp. Only what exists in a few um, seed bank repositories around the world have a few things. So we're hoping we can learn something interesting from these wild populations. Maybe find something useful.
And I imagine some people have done some evolutionary tree kind of work on some of um, these hemp crops and hemp strains.
Yeah, there are a number of folks who are working on trying to unravel the history of domestication,
Hmm.
and it's complicated. It's complicated because the plant it's just one species. You can interbreed any cannabis plant with any other cannabis plant, and it's so widely cultivated. It's going to be a hard story to unravel for that reason. The
Yeah.
closest relative we have is hops. The flowers of hops vines are used in beer making. Um, I don't think there's any coincidence there, actually, because hops also have some psychoactive effects.
Hmm.
But the hops and the cannabis plant, I mean, they diverged tens of millions of years ago. I mean, we've worked on using DNA to estimate um, the how deep that family tree goes back,
Hmm.
and there's fossil evidence also. And it's really hard because unlike a lot of our cultivated plants that have sort of wild relatives in some part of the world that we're pretty confident they're wild populations, wild relatives. Cannabis, we've been tangled up with it for so long in our history that it just seems like a lot of that history may have been maybe obscured,
Hmm.
and we'll see what comes out of all the genetic work that folks are doing who are tackling this using the new really high throughput DNA sequencing that can deliver a genome at lightning speed.
Hmm. It sounds fascinating. So we've got to close pretty soon, but I just want to end by asking you if there's what are kind of the major um, research directions you're going in now on studying hemp, its genetics, and how to breed or engineer new varieties that are more viable as a domestic crop.
Well, um, the the engineering, you mentioned engineering, and of course that, and since we're doing genetics, that always raises the question about genetic engineering. And I
Hmm.
should say that for the audience, we initially proposed some work in which we would do some use some biotechnology
Hmm.
to potentially produce new cannabis varieties, but I learned very quickly from the industry, from the hemp industry, that it has a very strong
Yeah,
anti-GMO position,
I'm sure.
and so we're sensitive to that and respectful of that, and are currently pursuing conventional approaches to breeding rather than transgenic cannabis, which that's
Okay.
a question. And there are folks who are working on that. I'm not one of them.
Hmm.
Uh, but the direction we're taking next is to continue studying the crossed population that we have to further understand how hemp and drug type cannabis are different. We're pursuing that. We're also gearing up for an agricultural or an agronomic field trial where, in collaboration with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, we're planning to plant out about 12 different commercial varieties of hemp and see how they perform at sites in Minnesota. And this is similar to work that's going on in North Dakota and Kentucky and Colorado and other states. We want to see how it does here in Minnesota.
And then hopefully select some of the most successful crop varieties of industrial hemp.
Yeah, and at least I think there's great interest here uh, in developing certified seed that Minnesota farmers could produce that would go through a certification process to supply a market should we reach that point when domestic hemp production and demand are matched up.
Yeah.
Um, and I think we are probably growing closer to that day, certainly a lot faster than I ever expected. When
Uh-huh.
I started doing this project 15 years ago, I never could have imagined what people would be doing and what we'd be talking about in 2016. It's just kind of a really dramatic evolution and turn of events.
And so there's sort of this sense of excitement in the field that that industrial hemp is kind of poised as a potential domestic industry.
Yeah, I mean, the conferences that are bringing people together to talk about this, people coming from so many different sectors to think about it and talk about it, is very exciting, and I'm really kind of honored to be a part of that conversation. So, thanks for having me on the webinar.
Yeah, thank you. And good luck with the research. I hope you keep us posted.
Will do.
All right.
Thank you, Katie.
Take care, George. Thank you so much.
Bye now.